I'm going to miss this, spending this time with you, although, as you'll hear me say more than once today, we can spend next week together too with the Violympic trials. But I'm especially glad to share the end of this E major partita with you. As always, let me know where you're saying hi from, and I'll do the same. We are in Athens here. Wonderful. If you're on Facebook, I'll of course keep an eye on your conversation, questions, comments. My idea for today is to leave extra time at the end just to talk through some of this Bach as a whole set. Get to some more general questions and comments once we've looked at the last two movements of this E major, the Bourrée and the Gigue. Been quite a journey, as I say, ending here in Athens today, and it just wouldn't have been the same by myself, or even in front of a live audience. This was really special because you guys are all over the world, and this great music brought us together. So thanks again for joining me here. Yep. Wonderful. As always, there are people from all over the world, and then right in my backyard too, here in Southern California. So great to see you. Good. Last time we looked at, kind of finished up looking at the Bourrée, looked at the gavotte and rondo as a storytelling framework, that sort of chorus and verse structure. Looked at the two minuets and how those relate. Today we're going to look at the Bourrée and the Gigue. So the Bourrée is the one that starts. And I'd just like to remind you and all of us about these movements in some of the other partitas. The three sonatas, G minor, the A minor, the C major, have almost exactly the same structure, right? That slow first movement, fugue for a second movement, slowish, beautiful third movement as a relief, and then fast last movement in 16th notes. And the partitas have very different structures. I mean, they're all dance suites of a kind. The D minor, of course, has the massive last movement, the chaconne, that's the least like a dance maybe of any of the partita movements. The E major, this one started with that fantastic preludio, and that's not exactly a straight dance movement either. But aside from that, so many different dance movements. The B minor has four of them, each with its double. So here, these last two movements, the Bourrée and the Gigue, they have counterparts in other partitas. So it's interesting to maybe compare the tempos, compare the characters, and does that maybe inform how we'd play them here. So if you remember, the B minor Bourrée was now, that is a lot harder to execute quickly than this one. So should they still be the same or similar tempos? I think that it's worth exploring, it's worth thinking about a little bit, just because we can play this one really fast. Do we have to? I think by now the answer is no, we don't have to. Maybe does that mean we might try to play the B minor one a little faster? A lively dance in two. It's possible. It may be even more possible and desirable on the older instruments with the older bows, where everything's a little bit gentler, not quite as brilliant. The strings are closer together, so playing 4 notes even easier on those older instruments. You wouldn't have been going for so much projection either back then. So I mentioned this just to get your wheels turning about how the tempos may have been more similar for these 2 bourrées back in the day, by which I mean a couple hundred years ago at least. So this bourrée, might that work at a similar tempo? I think so. At least it's perhaps a caution not to let this get out of control, to keep it as a dance in 2, whatever that's going to mean to us. It's a lively dance, as is the last movement, the Gigue. That's the one that starts. Now the D minor partita has a Gigue as well, and that is a little easier to map right onto this one, tempo-wise, character-wise. Could almost just take the same. It's funny, this one, it's not quite as tempting, is it, to accent every beat. With that D minor, we really had to talk about shaping, making the longer line and avoiding a lot of down bow accents. The rhythm there, I think, is a little more repetitive, huh? Getting that emphasis on every beat, had to kind of work to... And at that point, then it was a little easier to get the big line. With this Gigue, it's just more natural. We've got the scale stuff almost right away, and those are very natural to show the line, not to put so many accents on beats. So that one, I don't have much uncertainty about tempo, but this Bourrée, let me play the entire first half as I'm used to playing it and hearing it, which is on the quick side. That's how I'm used to playing it, except for one note that I played wrong. Hopefully I'm not used to doing that. Let's try something a little slightly more stately dance-wise. Still in 2. Certainly more relaxing. Tried to do a little composing there and put us in major before it was time. Interested to see your thoughts on this Bourrée tempo. It's just a little hard to imagine a dance 2, 1. That starts to become a march to my ears. Great, great, great. Romeo votes for Paganini on the road. How about we use the Violympic trials to get in shape for Paganini on the road? If we ever do that, it would probably be worth it just to take a whole tour around Italy. Italy has so many amazing places to visit. I don't know if you guys, by the way, have watched the program that has been airing on PBS with Scott Yu. Violinist Scott Yu is the host. I think it's called Now Hear This. But there, they visit a different location each time, talking about different composers, and it's a great series. Scott's an old friend and fabulous violinist and host. So we have a slightly lower budget here for Bach on the road, but yeah, could see that Paganini on the road starting right there, and maybe we could, either start or end in Cremona. All right, but let's get in shape for that first. Michael Kreutzer etudes, that's another great idea. I have to say, studying the Kreutzers for a second time, because my first time was growing up, so probably from ages 10 to 13 is when I did most of the Kreutzers for the first time. But even though my teacher told me why we were doing them, I still wasn't fully aware of why. That had to come for the second time, my late 20s and early 30s. And now those are etudes I continue to study, and they make Bach a lot easier. It's not that they're harder than Bach, because in a way there's nothing harder than Bach. But when you have spent hours and hours over a period of weeks or months looking at string crossings, then challenges, even in a movement like this Bourrée, playing those smoothly and with connection and with shape just becomes second nature. Again, whenever I say something like that, I'm waiting for the lightning bolts, because now when I play it through for you, I'm going to play one of those unevenly. But yeah, everything from the double stops, the hand frame, the articulations in different parts of the bow, all of that can be found in the Kreutzers, and it's why Heifetz played them and taught them his whole career. And I do mean played. He would practice them. Good. Well, Ingrid votes for Bourrée on the slow side. I didn't mean to, lead you guys to any particular conclusion, but now, Paula, you mentioned that when you studied in college, your teacher told you to think of it as a peasant dance. I think that's what I'm after, yes, with that slower tempo. It has to be a dance, and since these are instrumental pieces, and I said this from the outset, that does give us license, I believe, unless you're actually playing this accompanying a village barn dance or something. Yes, it's titled as a dance. We know it's a dance, but it is a piece for violin, and as such, it has to be satisfying to our listeners, some of whom may not care about the dance aspect. But I think the strongest character comes from blending those two, the instrumental sound, the instrumental satisfaction and joy of playing with the roots, so to speak. And just for us to know when we play how amazing it was that Bach could take these dance forms, which generally weren't used to make transcendent music, they were used for entertainment, to use those forms to write pieces that are so satisfying and that don't wear out their welcome. When he had something worth exploring for 15 minutes, he did it, like the chaconne or the fugues that go on for a while. Things like this, you dip into the style and dip out. And that's why they're so satisfying to play now. Ernst on the road. Good. That's the suggestion that's making me laugh the most. Have you guys ever looked at any? I mean, the most famous of the 6 Ernst polyphonic etudes is the Last Rose of Summer, right? Uh, uh, with all its variations. You might say that the Violympic theme I wrote for next week maybe owes a little debt to the Ernst. It's in the same key even. So that's number 6, but all 6 of them are interesting, fiendishly difficult. Even the very first one. Sorry, I know we're drifting away from Bach, but this is a wrap up anyway. That first one. Hopefully you can see some resemblance to some of the challenges in Bach, but yeah, the little second theme for that is but it has an accompanying voice. Something like that. So yeah, I don't know how far I could take those on the road. Good, we'll get back to Bach. As far as a good time to start the Kreutzer for someone who's more on the beginner side, I mean, generally, most experienced teachers that I know end up starting those, a little before the more adult concertos, or so maybe around the same time as one might play Seitz and Viati, maybe. Perhaps you're learning Bach concertos at the same time. Perhaps you're learning a Mozart concerto, probably after things like Vivaldi. I don't know. I mean, there can be different times, and the Kreutzers vary in difficulty too, but certainly by the time you're playing things like Mendelssohn and Bruch, those concertos are very difficult if you haven't played some of the Kreutzers and studied some of those concepts already. So, for a kid who's kind of doing the standard path, and they're maybe starting with their 4, 5, 6, probably they're doing Kreutzers when they're 10, 11, something like that. Grown-ups, I think, can start them much earlier, just because grown-up brains get concepts a whole lot faster. So even after a year or within the first year, it's not too early to start looking at some of those etudes, I think, and some of the concepts, as long as you know why you're doing, what the point of each etude is. And yes, I'm going to speak about the new project, the Violympics, definitely before we finish today, because that's how we can keep spending time together. I will save that if that's all right. Great. Let me play the whole Bourrée, actually, and let's try to center on a tempo that blends joy and dancing, because after all, those should go together. So it'll be a little slower than perhaps what I've been used to, but that's what I feel like trying today. Then it'll be Gigue time. That's a really short movement without the repeats. I neglected to mention, as with a lot of these dance movements especially, this is one that is usually aided by some bowings of convenience. Now, what are the likeliest places? It's these 5-note slurs, right? Obviously, if you don't do anything to counteract, and now we're out of bow. So often what we'll do is hook. And I certainly learned it that way. Maybe it's just being stubborn now in old age. I really like to play these printed bowings when I can, not because I think that Bach absolutely intended for every performer to, play it exactly as he has written, because there are clearly places in these 6 sonatas and partitas where we're expected to try different things and make our own bowing variations. But I think there is a reason for the slurs, right? And it's interesting to go for those different articulations, those different note lengths, the different importance in different parts of the bar. So the first note of a slur, more important than the separate notes. Maybe I even lean on it rhythmically slightly so that it's slightly longer than the other notes, and then I make up the time, otherwise known as rubato, right? Remember that the root for the word rubato is, to take or steal. And the rule of rubato really is, what you take, you have to give back at some point, unlike true stealing. But so I do 2 things. I conserve the bow in the slur, and then a little lighter on the 3 separate notes, using more bow on the up bows. And over the course of 4 of those, sure, maybe I've worked my way somewhat up the bow, but not the whole way, right? When I do the hooks, of course now I'm doing the hooks in the most boring way possible, but it's just that becomes tempting because you've evened out all the challenges, therefore you can even out all the notes. So it's on you, whatever bowing you choose to do, to make sure that you've got that shape. But more and more over the years, I like to explore at least the bowings that Bach put in there to see if maybe they're actually doable after all, which in this case I think they are. Great. Let's go to the Gigue, because I want to leave time for all this great general discussion that we've got. There aren't any particular bowing challenges in this. As with any of the fast Bach movements, right from the very first one, meaning the last movement of the G minor, one of the big topics we covered that day, which seems like an eternity ago, 5 weeks, one of the big topics we covered in that movement was the fact that your bow speed and pressure, of course, that your contact point depends on your bow speed and pressure. And so when you're playing a movement like this slowly, right, you want a beautiful sound and all that, but look where I am, fairly close to the bridge. Probably closer to the bridge than the fingerboard. And that's possible at that tempo because the bow is moving relatively slowly, even for these 16th notes. If I'm playing fully in tempo and I stay right there, I'm going to get a ponticello sound unless I really, really bear down and use extreme pressure. That's at least, it's an acceptable sound. It's not ponticello, it's not crushed. I think, though, we might call it a little pressed, a little direct for a movement like this. Much nicer sound, of course, out here a little bit. But that does change a few things. Namely, the strings are much closer together, or they feel at least much closer together out here than they do close to the bridge. So that is one potential downfall of just practicing a movement like this slowly and expecting it to translate when you get fast. Because you go out here, your arm makes all the same motions it did before, and then all of a sudden you're hitting all kinds of extra strings because you don't have as much clearance on either side. So for that G minor movement, I remember talking about one of my favorite techniques, which is to double up the 16th notes so that the bow's moving fast, but the fingers are still moving slow. So now I can still listen carefully for pitch, but my bow is moving as it will, which means that I'm at the appropriate contact point. If you really want, you can get the same effect by not doubling up the notes, playing just single notes, but moving the bow fast. In other words, using a lot of bow. So that's another option as well. That's a little tiring for the arm, but that also results in you getting the same contact point as you're going to have when it's fast. Robert, as far as fingerings, you ask, is it advisable to play Bach in first position whenever possible or whenever feasible for the sake of clarity and tone color? And I do advise that when possible. We've talked a few times about how back then, not only no shoulder rest, but no chin rest. And this idea of shifting all around was just a lot harder to do, and it wasn't done as much. So, of course, there are places you have to play up in position. Last movement of the C major sonata. No way getting around that. You've got to shift up for that. But this is another one of those things. Mid 20th century, in general, tempos were slower, more vibrato, more sustain, more shifting around, playing up in higher positions. And then there was kind of a backlash to all that, right? Faster tempos, less vibrato, less sustain, more open strings, more first position. And we're still kind of in that era, and I like it. I think you can play most of this music in first position, and exactly, the strings are longer that way. You tend to get more ring, a more open sound, and that's very appropriate for many of the movements and for most of this E major partita, I think. Does that mean that I'll still play? Maybe I'd like to keep on one string, because that's the other consideration. First position is a more open sound, but maybe in a case like this, what I value even more than that is keeping one slur on one string, or one figure, or one group on one string. And then back. I'm trying to look for places in this movement where people will commonly go up and where I might choose to stay down. most of the time those decisions come down to which poison, you pick your poison. Usually you have to pick between more shifting, which keeps a fingering perhaps more convenient, keeps it on fewer string crossings, or play it in first with more string crossings, more awkward string crossings. In the first movement of this, the Preludio, for example, I can find a good spot, I think, for that. Some people would play to keep everything on one string, to avoid crossing over for just one note. That's the kind of thing I just don't mind doing. I don't mind the extra string crossings. Something like that, I will purposely make sure that I play in a position that gives me the most string crossings possible. That's a major feature of this movement, right? And so all of that is to say that in general I answer your question with a yes. I do advise mostly first position when I can do it. Yeah, and Michael, you mentioned the half position, something I just got to, like in that Preludio. Absolutely essential to know where your hand frame is, where that 1 is, where 1 and 4 are going to fall. If you're just kind of crawling, then once you get off, it can be hard to find your bearings again to get back on. So to know what's a reach, what's a shift, what's your frame doing. Good, let me play the Gigue. Good, I thought I might use the repeats in 2 ways, to give me second chances at things and to try a few bowing variations. So, sometimes when you try things in the spur of the moment, they work, and sometimes you stumble a little. So, it's pretty clear that this is not a prepared performance version, but, something I'm experimenting with. I mention that because especially in the second half, there are very few slurs, and it seems a little bare to me. And especially if you're going to do the repeats, I think it's worth trying some different things. this series especially. I think that's worth doing in a couple different ways. Could even be 3. These as well. It's nice for you, the player, nice for the audience, especially for those people that are playing or have played the piece themselves, and you know, they can take some delight in watching you experiment as well. Good. Get a little water after that. Paula, you say you just try to avoid anything past the 3rd position in general. Now, Joanna, you ask about shifting, and I do have a specific way of practicing it. And the material that I usually use to teach that is the Sevcik book, the Opus 8, Shifting the Position. But really you can use any shift or any passage you like. The Sevciks are nice because he was a compulsive guy. He liked to write a lot of things out rather than just saying, do it like this on all strings and in all keys. He would actually write it out on all strings and all keys. So it's just nice to have that all staring you in the face. I'll just very briefly talk about shifting here. There's one myth that I would just love to dispel about shifting, and that's that you need to hide your shifts with how your left hand moves on the string. And many of us were just taught this way. So it's the myth I'd like to dispel. So that if you were shifting, let's say, a shift that you do 1,000 times in your sleep, but something like that, this thought that you need to pick up the finger, maybe ghost it, get to the new position, and then put the finger back down. In other words, like, and that's how you hide a shift. So when people tell me they want to hide a shift, usually I just ask why. Because if that's truly what you're after, then maybe you want a different fingering. If you really don't want to hear anything there. And I know where this comes from. I mean, a lot of us, we're handed fingerings by our teachers, or we see printed fingerings in a part. If there's that shift on a slur, we convince ourselves that our job is to hide that, to make it so it doesn't sound schmeary. The thing is, there's a whole world of difference between hiding it and schmeary. So the concept that I would love for you to internalize is that the hand and the finger should always move on the string in an expressive way. That's the slow version. Now, if I really don't want people to hear that at all, I'm simply going to choose a different fingering, because if I'm sliding my finger on the string, people are going to hear it. Separate bows, that's a different story. We'll talk about that. But if you listen to any of the great players, the players you admire, when they slide, when they shift during a slur, you're going to hear something. Now, the timing of the shift or the slide determines what kind of effect it has on you, the listener. Let's say that instead of 1 to 1, it was 1 to 3. I could do that with the old finger as I just did. Slowly, in other words, starting it earlier. Then you really hear it. I could do it a lot later. Now it's starting to sound, you might almost say I'm hiding it. It's there, it's just closer to the end. I could also do that shift with the new finger, couldn't I? That calls a lot more attention to itself. That too I could do earlier, call even more attention. That's so early we'd probably say it's bad taste, or very late. So there's a whole world of possibilities, none of which involve me hiding the shift. And so when I'm practicing that, to get used to the distance, to get used to the feel of the finger on the string, I keep it in there and I'm listening very carefully for the guide note, which in this case is that D. As soon as I hear that, or as soon as I hear that I'm about to arrive, then the finger flattens completely onto the string and I drop the new finger. I don't hang out on that note. No, I carefully time it. I do the shift as slow as I want, the slide as slow as I want. As I reach the new note, I drop the new finger. And that's the process I'll use even in performance. Shifting up to that D, dropping the new finger. If I'm doing it with the 3, same, I listen very carefully for the arrival. And that's when the finger flattens completely into the string. Get my vibrato if I'm using vibrato. And that's the way I would work on any shift. And in the Sevcek etudes, I have a very systematic way of going through those and working all the different kinds of shifts. We've got ascending old finger, ascending new finger, exchange shifts, right? 3 to 2, which I want to be able to do smoothly as well. So that's the intro to that. Something we'll definitely be talking about next week. And I know, Ingrid, you'd use the word slogging. Slogging through Sevcek Opus 8, and I get it, because it's a long book, very repetitive, and I think we're often given no map through it, right? Teacher gives us the book, and it's like, go to it, and you do it for 2 days, and it's super boring. So the way I like to use it is more fun. There's a system, but it's more fun. Well, yeah, Michael, you mentioned on a trombone, you've got no choice but to slide. And so I would look at violin a lot the same way. When you're changing position, it can be done on a slur, in which case people are going to hear it and you want to make it sound nice. Or it could be done on separate bows, in which case you put it super late. But even in that situation, my hand is still moving like that. I'm just shifting right before the bow change. But the bow never stops, the hand never stops. Great. Well, I'll be watching the chat for your thoughts on Bach overall and the trip we've taken around the 6 pieces around the world. And while you put some thoughts down, I'll let you know what's happening next week. These Violympic trials, and that's really a fun way to get into the Violympics, which are just going to happen during what's traditionally kind of a dead zone anyway, that June, July, August period. Even before current circumstances, I wanted to have a way for those of you who needed some extra motivation, some ways to organize your practice, maybe just some ways to examine some technical issues that you hadn't examined in a while, or learn some new skills. I wanted a way to organize that, make it fun, make it a group, a worldwide community effort. Fun games, there's scoring, there's points for those interested in that. You don't have to get into that part of it if you don't want, but over 12 weeks, starting June 1st, it's going to be 6 2-week events, right? And so it's broken up like that because we've all got busy schedules, even during this time, frankly. And so if you've got one busy week or 1 week where you're tired and you don't want to you're not off track. Don't worry. Every event is like a new thing. And what happens in each 2-week event is go through some of these key concepts. One 2-week event is definitely going to be heavily weighted toward shifting and this subject, my system for working on that. And so over the first 9 or so days of the 14, go through those concepts with specific exercises, a daily practice plan, and then the last 5 days of each 2-week unit, special challenge. I reveal a piece that you definitely haven't seen before, or you'd have to be a real scholar to have seen it before, or it could be something brand new like the one I wrote for next week. And in those 5 days, the challenge is to learn it and record it. If you're scoring points, then you record it and post it. But if you're just doing it just to do it for your own satisfaction, still make that recording, because that's part of the process. It really focuses that practice, and it proves to you that you can learn something new in just 5 days. So that's what next week is. It's just the 5 days. It's the challenge part. And yes, for that I wrote a brand new piece, the Violympic theme, stirring. It's patriotic, no matter what country you're from. And it sounds just like John Williams mixed with Elgar. But yeah, the theme goes something like this. There's an introduction, but the theme is... and it goes from there. It's there are virtuosic variations and all that. And there's the second theme in another key. But I've also written it to be very adaptable, very flexible. There's a place there's double stops. If you haven't worked much with double stops, that this might be an opportunity for you to get more comfortable with that. Or you might just say, I'm going to play one of the options. I wrote an option without the double stops. There's a place with octaves. If that's just beyond what you're doing now, then don't bother trying to do the crash course in 5 days. Maybe you can do an alternative, which I've written. So the whole thing is like that. You can kind of put together your own Violympic theme that's a challenge for you in those 5 days. And every day here live, work on it. I've got the plans to go through it step by step in the 5 days, figure out just how you're going to polish it for your own performance. And then you take the weekend, Saturday, Sunday, make a recording, post it, if you're scoring points, that is. And there are other ways to score points. If you've already registered for this, you've gotten that in the welcome email. If you haven't registered yet, go do it. It's easy to find. If you just go to natesviolin.com, you'll see the link there. But that lays out the point system. Person who scores the most points in all the different ways gets a free spot in the Violympics. But really, it's just going to be fun for everyone. It's a cool little piece that's definitely been stuck in my head for the last week. But it'll just be a way that we can keep spending time together, working together. And if you need a reason to get the violin out of the case and Bach's not doing it for you, then the Violympics might. Let's see. DMA auditions. You should try that. Should say, yeah, if they have a requirement, you must present a piece by a living composer. Well, that's me. Take this Violympic theme, and I think if you play it well and impressively, it really will, raise people's eyebrows. Well, and Donald, you really nailed it. You say striking how much, I think you mean how much of this experience came from the asides and responses to comments, plus the comments themselves, the discussion. I mean, no question. Because I could have just sat out here and said I'm going to record all the Bachs, or play through them and teach them and whatever, but most of that's been done before. But this is what made it special for me, was to have everybody together at the same time, and even to know that a lot of people who couldn't catch it live would be watching perhaps later that day or later in the week. And I've gotten a lot of comments from people who have seen these on YouTube and said, okay, I missed the G minor from however many weeks ago, but just now actually I started working on the G minor, so it's been great to go back and, not just to see what you said about the G minor, but the questions that other people had about the piece and how you responded and all that. So yeah, I agree that's really what's made it special for me. So, and Joanna, you already practiced octaves this morning, so that's good. You can. It's like I just read an interview recently with the mayor of L.A. and it was kind of a strange quote, but it's been stuck in my head lately. When he said, "If I'm ever up and I'm wondering when's the right time to take a shower, it's now." And I often feel that way about practicing. Of course, these days with the kids at home all the time, don't always have that luxury, but when the kids were out of the house, if I'm sitting around wondering when's the right time to practice, it's probably now. But next week anyway, you can do your practicing with a whole big group. And now, Thomas, you ask, where can you hear about the Gavotten Rondo? That was the last session, Wednesday. That was Bach on the Road 17. We had a lot of fun going through some different ways of shaping that. Well, thank you, Darlene. Yeah, you're looking forward to next week in the Violympic trials. Yeah, I would just encourage you. I've gotten a lot of questions about, is it appropriate for viola? Yes, because I'm also sending out a viola version of the theme. I've already vetted it with a violist I know, so you have your own version of the theme in a mixture of alto and treble clef and down a fifth and all that, so that'll work. Questions about, I'm not a professional. Most of the time you're working with professionals. Is this okay for me? And yes, as I said, the theme is flexible, adaptable, and really, just all the shifting stuff I was talking about before is the same information I share with the professionals that I work with, the people taking auditions, people winning auditions. We all need a reminder now and then, and myself included. I play for a colleague or a mentor, and it's not always that I'll get new information, although often I do, but it's just sometimes hearing something for the fourth or the fifth or the 12th time, finally it clicks, like, oh yeah, I've heard that now from several people, or now I remember my teacher saying that when I was 16 and it didn't make sense then, but now I get what they were after. And yes, it does work that way. And that makes the difference. In a whole summer, if you refine one thing, maybe it's your control of contact point, maybe it's playing off the string, vibrato, finally getting some clarification on that. Yes, shifting, intonation consistency. I mean, in a summer, if you can make some progress on one of those things, that's a memorable summer. So it's my goal with this that you have like 4 or 5 at least of those concepts that you make some great progress on, and hopefully faster than you thought too, because once you get in the groove, you're making changes. It doesn't take monster hours every day. It's more just keeping an open mind, keeping open ears, and having someone kind of kick your butt once in a while, like keep moving, keep going, next event is coming up. Well, Aaron, surely you're not the only one if you mentioned that some of these concepts you haven't gotten to yet. That's the point. If I wasn't interested in just covering things that I knew everyone already knew, there may be a couple of you out there who know all this and more, and well, then I want to watch your series. But hopefully there were some new avenues to explore through all this, and you can always go back and watch these, because I'm gonna leave them on YouTube for now. And to be honest, I'll go back and watch, because I didn't get all of your comments and questions, unfortunately, as they were coming in, but they're going to be great food for thought for me the next time I perform any of these, which I certainly hope is soon. Hope it's soon in front of a live audience as well. Or maybe we'll just do this again. Oh, Michael, you ask about bow, and I'll mention bow and violin. So the bow I've been using for most, if not all of these. It's a little hard for me to remember, but at least for the last few weeks, it's a bow that I own. It's from it's stamped Viome, as so many bows were, because he ran a big workshop of some of the most skilled bow makers in history. Some, not all. So it's stamped Viome. There's a little question who made it. I mean, it's got to be one of a very few people. What the consensus seems to be, because Paul Childs includes this in his book on the Picots, consensus seems to be that it was by Charles Picot. Charles. And the interesting thing about it is that it has a lens here. You're not really going to be able to see it clearly, I'm sure, but instead of just a decorative mother of pearl circle there in the middle of the frog, it's actually a photographic lens, and or a couple glass elements, and trapped in between those glass elements is a tiny, probably just how big would it be? Probably just 2 millimeters square piece of film. And it's a photograph of Viome himself with his name right below it. And so if you look through the curved side of this into a strong light source, you can clearly see his photo with his name below it. So it's what they call a picture bow. And a great many of the picture bows did have a picture of Viome in there because it was his workshop. But there are even some racy versions of the picture bows. Those are pretty rare, and so they tended to put them on sticks that they thought were good. But that's my bow, and then the violin is not mine. That belongs to the orchestra, LA Phil, and it is Stradivarius from 1729, which is pretty late for Stradivarius, and it is called the Benny, the Jack Benny, because it belonged to Jack Benny, and that's what I'll leave you with, I guess. If you don't know who Jack Benny is or was, do yourself a favor, look him up on YouTube, and read about him a little bit, especially for some younger players. You watch a couple clips on YouTube, it might not strike you as hilarious at first. You see a older guy playing the violin in black and white, and he sounds kind of bad. You have to know just how famous, breathtakingly famous and popular he was for several decades. A real pioneer of radio, had his own radio program, one of the first to have his own television program named after him. It was just the Jack Benny program. And to think that he played a character based on himself who played the violin, like that was the thing that everybody knew about Jack Benny. He plays the violin. I mean, nowadays you can barely get famous as a violinist, even if you're a great professional violinist. But back then he got famous as a violinist being a comedian. And one of the pieces for the theme music was Kreutzer number 2. And for a few decades anyway, at least in the US, just about everybody in the country would have known that tune. They would have called it the Jack Benny program theme music, even if they didn't know it was Kreutzer 2. So there you go. This was the violin that made it famous. Well, great. Great. I'm going to leave you with that. Violympics, if you're not already part of it, head to natesviolin.com. You should see a banner right at the top that says register for the Violympic trials. I'd love to have you there. It's every day next week, 11 a.m. Pacific for half an hour. But as soon as you register, you get the welcome email. You won't get the music, though, until Monday. Everybody gets it Monday because we're going to learn it in 5 days. So wonderful to share this project with you. Wish you health and happiness, and hope to see you next week. Bye-bye.